Enemy at the Gates, part of the Operational Combat series. There have been a few comments from people about the threat posed to my chances of playing this by my cats, and normally I would agree with them completely, and in fact it would be completely insane to set this game up without some sort of protection from my cats. And here you can see what that protection is. I have these sort of mesh screens all the way across the board. I've got one that's 4 foot square, this one here, and one that's 4 foot by 2 foot, that one there, and they are what's keeping the cats well away from the board. So if I bring the camera down here, you can see there's a sort of a square sort of steel bar, and then this mesh all the way across it, and the cats don't like walking across that stuff, and this has kept everything, my game of Reluctant Enemies and now my game of Enemy at the Gates, very safe. Enemy at the Gates then, still continuing with setup, but here you can start to see the setup going on of the Russians, so I just thought I'd give this a quick view while I've got them all sort of just thrown into the zones that I was talking about that they set up in. So you can see individual blocks of troops that I've just dropped into their sort of setup areas like this. And you can also start to see where the potential is for some Russian attacks. So for example, you can see that this zone in here, the 5th Tank Army, has a very narrow frontage across here, just 1, 2, the HQ is starting there, there's no choice over that, but you can see they've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 hex frontage to cover, and you can see that they've got a significant infantry force, 26th Tank Corps, 1st Tank Corps, those might actually be out on, yeah, tank corps, lots of artillery, lots of those rocket launcher Katyushas, and yeah, so significant force concentrated there. And then right next door in this zone, the 21st Army, again a very narrow frontage with a lot of stuff to pack into there. So it looks like this Romanian sector here might be the initial attacking area, with support obviously, and then you've got by contrast this area where there are all these level 1 hedgehogs. There's a very wide zone running from that yellow line there all the way around the Don River, round up over here, and they've got to cover it with a pretty minimal set of troops there. So yeah, that maybe isn't looking so attractive all of a sudden, given that they've got to defend as well as attack here. They can't just leave the door open for the Germans to go causing trouble. But we'll see how that looks. And also the Russians get a lot of these groovy pontoon units like this, and that allows them to cross rivers with no penalties, or it turns major rivers into minor rivers. And no, actually I think the Russian ones turn major rivers into no penalty at all, if I remember the rules on these pontoon units correctly. Not for attacking though. If you attack across the river, you suffer the normal penalties, but in terms of movement points, and that means that in theory the Russians could look at something like taking this unit, sliding it down here to this pontoon unit, and straight across the river, and across that pontoon unit and into here, and diverting this attack through these Romanians actually down in this direction. If I felt like doing that, and I might look at things like that, but trying to make crafty use of these pontoon units to open up new options. Yeah, anyway, so here we go around, in all the zones around here, and set up zones and so on. And down over here, there's a very potent set of forces here. There's a 4th Mechanised in here, and that you can see
that going into infantry or cavalry in open ground like this is just going to make a huge mess of it. So there are some tempting looking opportunities down here to take these Romanians out, and with the aim of threatening that railroad there. As the Russians, I've decided I want to get hit at roughly that railhead there, because it's a short distance from our front lines to get through into this railhead. Cut that rail line and get through somewhere in this area, and we've got to make it down here really into this railroad to that bridge where that railhead is again. So if we can cut just behind that railhead and the Don River there, then that is going to cut all the rail supply into Stalingrad and going to make the German life of the Germans in there pretty miserable. So that's the kind of aim in the opening turn. As you can see, setup is taking me a while, but you know, that's to be expected, and you've just got to enjoy it. And it is actually great fun trying to seeing the troops arrive and looking at what you've got and what the potential for it might be. No doubt I'm misjudging that quite badly in some cases, but yeah, that's part of the game. Here with Enemy at the Gates by the Gamers, part of the Operational Combat series. And the Russians are on the board. I've completed setup for this Russian army, which was a lot of fun, it has to be said. That was actually a very enjoyable thing to do, to go through, plonk them down in their zones and start trying to come up with sort of plans about how they might work and how they might work with what's next to them and so on. I've just put the Airforce down. I've no idea really what I was doing with that, so I just tried to do something that looked sensible to me, but it may turn out not to have been sensible at all. The Russian Air Force is spread out in airfields behind the front line, which you can kind of see stacks here and there like this, and in some cases I've just offset them to the actual hex they're in, just for convenience, like that and like that, because there's a bit of space back here where you can. But yeah, the Russian forces, as you can see, are set up here. Had to pay quite a lot of attention to the state of the rivers over the next few turns, because the Volga is ice packed, which means you can't get across it even with bridging. But other rivers are crossable, and the Russians have got pontoons that they can get across the rivers with in various places, or pontoon units that they can set up, and so it's quite a lot of fun trying to work out how to use those. I'll show you a pontoon unit. There you go, that's what a pontoon unit looks like, and I put one there because I thought it might be nice to be able to have some lateral movement across the Volga and not have this area separated entirely from this area. So, and I'm not entirely sure whether Russian reinforcements are coming on, but I think they might come on at places like this, Kamyshin up here. And so I thought, well, you know, I think there's a pontoon somewhere down here that would let it cross into this region, and then another one there. That's it. So it just gives the trying to give the Soviets a bit more, so the Russians a little bit more, a few more options in transferring their forces between different zones. Otherwise, they might get into a mess. But yeah, the main thrust at the moment is not where I would have liked it to be, here by these 111s, the 111 Hedgehogs that the Germans had. This zone proved to be quite extensive. You can see the yellow line there marking the front of that zone, or the top one edge of that zone, and then it comes all the way around here, and you can see the yellow line in there marking the other side, and they didn't have that many troops to cover that entire sector, so there certainly wasn't enough to put any great force in it in one area. The rest of it would have been bare, and there'd have been great holes in their own line, which I didn't like the look of at all. Yeah, the main thrust of Russian assault is going to be in this area. You can see that second guard's tank unit in there, but in some places there's a reserve marker back there with, I think, a tank corps, another reserve marker there with another tank corps, another reserve marker back here with a tank corps, and you can see the 26th tank corps in there, and then another powerful stack in there, and yeah, a lot of artillery backup, and this is going to be mayhem through here in the first turn, I feel. These rather sorry Romanian forces are going to feel the full weight of a Russian attack in this opening turn. Yeah, then it thins out considerably up here, and I was really struggling to even find a way to make a... I mean, there just aren't enough Russian troops up in this area, for example, in this zone, to make anything approaching a continuous front. I mean, it's just ridiculous. You've got a few hedgehogs and a couple of infantry divisions, and that's your lot. And I had to throw some armour back in a reserve almost with the HQ, just to go and firefight if there are any breakthroughs. And similarly over here, I think I stacked a couple of armour again with that HQ. Firstly, it's a good idea to protect your sort of HQs and depots, but secondly, because it's so thin along this front that there's just sort of outposts and the odd hedgehog and the odd, garrison unit and a bit of artillery, but there's not much up here if, those Italians and Hungarians actually want to make a move across the Don. The bridges are reasonably well defended, but once it freezes over, there's not going to be a lot stopping them, to be honest. However, the east bank of the Don probably isn't where you want to be right now. Anyway, that's setup done. So what else is there to talk about? A few things about special rules then, which are a little bit interesting. There's a sudden death rule. So victory conditions. Let's talk about that. Victory conditions are that the Russians are trying to amass a certain number of victory points by the end of the game, and they get victory points for geographical locations, so for taking territory. So the aim of the Russians is to take territory, and the aim of the Germans is to prevent the Russians taking territory. And handily, in this game, they've put the VP values on the map. So, for example, Stalingrad is worth 10 or 20 if the Germans declare it a fortress and really dig in there. That's a separate special rule. But you can also come down here and see that this place, Morozovsk, is worth 3, and this place here is worth 3, and there's some cities up over here worth 5, and so on. And I've still got my cap protectors up here, so you won't be able to see that section of the board, but I can tell you that Kharkov is worth 10, for example, and so on. And Rostov down here is worth 10, etc. So by the end of the game, the Russians want to have amassed, let me see if I can find that. Here we go. So 61 or more for a major victory. The draw is 40 to 49. Anything less than 40 is various degrees of a German victory. So the Russians are aiming for 50 VPs to get out into a victory situation. The Germans are aiming for 40 less, and the 40 to less than 40, and the 40 to 49 is the draw. However, there are sudden death victory conditions as well, and what this means is that turn by turn, if the Russians have amassed a certain number of victory points, they win instantly. And that number is here on the turn record chart, and you can see there the red number in brackets, the sudden death number. is what they're aiming for on that opening turn, on that turn. So on turn 1, were the Russians to manage to get 8 victory points, they would win instantly. Now, that's pretty much impossible, I think, but you can see it's still only 8 on turn 2 and 9 on turn 3 and 10 on turn 4. And what you can see that means is that the Germans cannot abandon Stalingrad in the opening 4 turns because it gives the Russians a sudden death victory. Were the Russians to take Stalingrad in any of the first 4 turns, they would have 10 victory points and they'd be over their VP. Sudden death requirements and would win. So those requirements essentially lock the Germans into defending Stalingrad for at least 4 turns. And that's kind of interesting because, well, firstly it means that my concerns about not getting a historical Stalingrad are going to be slightly offset by the fact the Germans are locked into defending it for at least 4 turns. I guess it also kind of means the downside is that this isn't a purely, military sandbox, I guess, because you might want to try and explore what would happen if, the German high command was being run with a little less hubris, and they made an actual sensible on the ground decision that actually coming into the winter the west bank of the Don might be a far more sensible place to be, and we'll come and retake Stalingrad in the spring. So it would be interesting for the Germans to be able to simply pull out straight out of here, to win an initiative roll and pull straight out of here and defend along a line down there. That might be quite an interesting situation, especially given that we know that there's a huge 5th Tank Army, 1st Guards Army ready to roll through the Romanians here. You still might end up with a very, very interesting situation, but one that didn't look anything like Stalingrad. Anyway, that isn't allowed. The Germans are locked into defending Stalingrad to a degree until at least turn 4. And even abandoning it on turn 4 and 5 and so on becomes very, very risky, because you can see that even on turns 5 and 6 and 7, 12, 13, 15, if you'd abandoned it by then, they'd only need to capture that and 3 or 5 victory points more. And that would only mean, for example, that, grabbing this place off the Italians or whatever. So, or having made it down into this area to take that airfield. So, the Soviets are given a big boost in a way by the fact that the sudden death victory points lock the Germans into certain courses of action. They're also given a boost in that the Germans don't get a reaction phase in the opening turn. So if the Russians take the initiative, which they will, the Germans don't get a reaction phase, and that has a couple of effects. If you're not familiar with OCS, you can have reserve markers on your corps, or on your troops, not just corps, but you can have reserve markers on stacks, and these are a limited resource. You're only allowed a certain number, but the Germans have 20 odd and the Russians have 17 or so, I think, in this game, because I've cut it down slightly. But what that means is that in your opponent's turn you can lose that reserve marker and act with those troops. You can move them, and I think you can barrage with them. You can't declare combat, but you can at least respond with some movement to what your opponent is doing. The alternative is that during your own turn you can drop the reserve during an exploit phase, so you can use them to have a second round of move and combat through gaps and holes that you've created in the enemy line if you're expecting to. So they can be used offensively and defensively, your reserves. So not giving the Germans a reaction phase in the opening turn means that there's very little profit for them having troops in reserve. Normally, if you looked at this German force, stuff like this would be in reserve. There's that stack under there would be in reserve. There's a Panzer army under there. That thing saying First Panzer division, that would be in reserve. But there's really no point, because they're not going to get the phase anyway in which to act, and they're simply risking being hit themselves in your half strength when you're in reserve. So they're simply risking the Russians punching straight through and then using their own reserve forces to come and engage them in an exploitation phase and getting rolled over like that. So they're best off in combat mode, waiting to see what happens. It also means, as I think, and I need to double check the rules on this, but you can fly your aircraft in your reaction phase. You can fly air missions, I believe. And that's a big deal, because it means the Luftwaffe is taken by surprise and is grounded during this opening Russian assault. Finally, I think the Russians get the choice of initiative in turns 2 and 3 as well. So they can arrange a double move by, if they wanted to, they can either press their going first advantage in turn 2, and then they might drop second in turn 3, hoping to get the advantage in the initiative again in turn 4 and get a double move. They can play like that with the initiative orders in the first 3 turns, depending on how things have gone for them. So let's see how this pans out. I'm almost ready to go. I'm just putting together some last admin bits for the dead piles, because that will provide you, both sides, with their available rebuilds for when they start rolling on the replacement tables. So I've got little bits like that to do, and then I'll be ready to go to try and hit the first turn.